Okay, well, since the house is full, I guess we'll start right at 2 o'clock. Thank you everyone for coming out to our second speaker series of this year. Our second one will be next month, March 23rd, and that will be our own Colin Ramsey. He's a docent at the Maritime Museum, and he will be speaking about World War II and propaganda. So we do these every year, so please keep your eye out. We're excited for all the different programs we have going on. And today I am happy to introduce our own Victoria Scannella. Victoria holds her master's degree from Rutgers University, Camden, and serves as the library assistant at the Cumberland County Historical Society, as well as the archivist at the Old Barracks Museum in Trenton. She has worked at several Philadelphia museums and historic sites, including the Union League of Philadelphia. Her specific areas of expertise are in Civil War history, Atlantic City during the 1920s, and 1990s New York mobsters. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Victoria Scannella, as Britt just introduced me. So today my presentation is on rum running and prohibition in Cumberland County during the 1920s. Um, Not a lot of people are really aware of kind of all the things that kind of happen in Cumberland County, especially as it pertains to things like prohibition and rum running and other kind of 1920s history. Usually you think more of like Chicago, Philadelphia, New York City, places like that with kind of more city life, more people, things like that. But it was in Cumberland County that a lot of really interesting stuff happened during the 1920s. So if you want to hit the first slide. So this is just a brief overview of kind of how things happened during the period leading up to Prohibition as we know it during the 1920s. So it was around the 1830s that the idea of specifically abstaining from drinking alcohol became an idea I, because of its corruption. And then following that down, excuse me, sorry. In 1855 is when more states, in addition to Maine, kind of decide to outlaw alcohol and follow these prohibitionist laws to try and mitigate any kind of corruption that they think that alcohol is kind of bringing into their states. This is a lot of the East Coast, including Rhode Island, Vermont, Connecticut, New York, places like that. But Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey are not yet included in that. So moving forward into 1869 was when the National Prohibition Party was founded, which was also a platform that was used for other social reforms a little bit later, including women's rights movements and things like that. And it was in 1873 that the Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded, which was a specific social group found that promoted the idea of prohibiting alcohol consumption entirely and allowing for there to be like less domestic issues, less money being spent because money is kind of a difficult financial situation due to the presidents and things like that during this 19th century, early 19th century or late 19th century. So they also worked towards other social issues down the line. And it was in 1893 when things are really starting to pick up with prohibition with the Anti-Saloon League. This was founded in Ohio with the goal of lobbying nationwide for prohibition laws to be put in place. This organization is actually still around today and has been renamed to the American Council on Alcohol Problems. And then now in 1919, leading right up into the 1920s, we have the 18th Amendment, which is known as the Volstead Act. If you want to hit the next slide for me, Britt. This was ratified by 36 states. This amendment specifically banned production, transportation, and the sale of drinks that contained more than 0.5% alcohol. And it did not technically prohibit the consumption of alcoholic beverages, just the production, transportation, and sale of it. So the act was officially enacted on January 17th, 1920, which is what we all know as the Roaring Twenties. So the specific legal language is after 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the importation thereof into or the exportation of from the United States and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. So that's the law that specifically went into effect in 1920. If you want to hit the next slide. So by banning and making the production and consumption of alcohol entirely illegal across the United States, it made it easier to reduce money that was being spent on alcohol and drink and instead bring uniform moral reforms across the country. The temperance movement was born out of fear and ignorance and was an effort to staunch any kind of like criminal activity that was present in the United States, which was believed to be as a result of alcohol consumption and had a lot to do with immigration and things like that. The Marshall, which was a ship captained by the infamous rum runner Bill McCoy, he has a rum named after him, very interesting individual. He was the first to land in this area with illegal liquor from the Bahamas. New Jersey was often referred to as the wettest state in the nation and was a prime location for bootlegging and rum running in addition to illegal gambling and other activities. For many decades, Cumberland County people have found bottles left in like the marshes of the Cohansey River and the Maurice River, left over from Prohibition. In the creeks and the rivers, rum-running syndicates were sneaking their wares through the county because it was a rural, sleepier county in an effort to avoid authorities and transport illegal liquor and alcohol to cities and states throughout the United States during Prohibition, specifically New York City and Philadelphia. So, despite outlawing liquor in the United States with the establishment of the Volstead Act, this did not deter those who were already invested in the possibility of making a fortune. Bill McCoy himself kind of stated every human being is out to gyp the government. And in other words, the incentive of making the money that could be made due to the demand of alcohol, despite the laws heavily outweigh all of that to say that the idea of breaking the law was heavily outweighed by the possibility of making all of this money and including incarceration and jail time. Small-time smugglers specifically began the practice of rum running in small boats along the Atlantic, but once mobsters like Al Capone, Enoch Johnson out of Atlantic City, people like that, once they got wind of how much money could be made from transporting and selling illegal alcohol, they immediately jumped in on that. Specifically in New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, places like that. If you want to skip to the next slide. Larger cargo ships that brought liquor overseas were referred to as rum schooners and were often darker in color intentionally, and they were also operated without lights to avoid detection, aside from using them as communication with other vessels around that were also transporting the illegal alcohol. Smaller ships would then pick up the cargo from that larger vessel and brought the liquor to the shore for distribution, which is also why New Jersey is specifically known as being rum row. In addition to the proximity to New York City and Philadelphia, it was also a huge stretch of beach. So it was really easy to come up the Atlantic and just land in those kinds of places. So ships utilized for rum running often sat directly off the shore of the East Coast, specifically outside of United States territory in international waters. And those that were also involved in such operations did not consider themselves to be criminals. However, because they were operating outside of the law, because they were technically in international waters. So aside from those that were already operating outside the bounds of the law, like the mobsters that I keep bringing up, they also just believed they found an independent opportunity to make money quickly and efficiently. So they didn't believe themselves to be criminals. Prohibition did not create criminals. It produced the opportunity of a lifetime. If you want to go to the next slide. So it wasn't until 1923 that stores of alcohol that had already been made prior to Prohibition started to kind of dwindle. And a person with a boat can make $5 for each trip made to and from Rum Row. On shore, each person waiting to unload the boat made $1 and again another dollar to load the truck. This is by 1920 standards, so a dollar is a lot more than what it is now. So by the middle years of Prohibition, the corrupt Prohibition agents were being removed from positions of power because it becomes obvious that they are corrupt and they are kind of having their palms greased by these mobsters and other people that are transporting the illegal liquor. So those who were genuinely enforcing Prohibition laws needed now a new tactic because it was so easy to be purchased out. And so now their new mission was to target specific operations by those whose names we know, such as Enoch Johnson in Atlantic City and Al Capone in Chicago. The Bureau also had a new mission. No longer was it going to bother going after restaurants, hotels, roadside stands. Now it was going to go after large-scale smuggling operations because it would be easier to weed them out. This included the smaller areas of Rum Row, such as Cumberland County, with the proximity to both Atlantic City and Philadelphia, as well as the accessibility to the Cohansey and Maurice rivers. It made this area much more attractive to both bootleggers and rum runners alike. If you want to go to the next slide. There were times, especially off the coast of Fortescue, that in an effort to outrun the Coast Guard ships because they were larger vessels, but they were quick because they're the Coast Guard, they have the ability to do that. It was either going to be the rum runners who were aboard the boats, or it was going to be their cargo. So over time, they would kind of throw rum and liquor overboard if they thought they were going to get caught, because generally they could not outrun these Coast Guard ships. So that's kind of how all of these bottles and things are being found in the marshes over time, because they're throwing them overboard and they wash up over time. So the proximity to the Cohansey River allowed for the boats to come in, load the liquor onto the trucks, and then distribute the liquor to wherever was necessary. Some rum runners felt that they were above bootleggers, that they were better than them, because it was more difficult to outrun the Coast Guard on the water and other dangers in the ocean than it was to just run away on land or drive away. It was easier to outrun them that way. So runners felt superior to bootleggers because smuggling on the high seas required more skill and more nerve than bootlegging. Rum runners considered themselves at a higher risk than the bootleggers because they were stuck in the ocean and could not outrun the Coast Guard ships. This was not always the case. It obviously depends location to location, and some smaller boats were able to escape the Coast Guard because they were quicker and easier to maneuver through the water. You want to go to the next slide? The rum trade was so prolific in the Cumberland County area that on top of the Cumberland Hotel in Bridgeton, there was a light that flashed to signal safety to rum runners along the coast. So the light that was flashing indicated to the rum runners that they could bring in their wares, that it was safe, that there was not going to be any prohibition agents or anyone that would turn them in. And allegedly, the Cumberland Hotel was the base for Chick Callahan's operations out of Cumberland County. John Callahan, originally of North Jersey, Prohibition fame, was a frequent flyer in Cumberland County during Prohibition. He, as a famed rum runner, brought a lot of illegal whiskey into Fortescue specifically during the 1920s. He was very, very wealthy and very generous with his money until two convictions kind of cost him the majority of that fortune. But overall, he was very, very giving with his money, and that's kind of what made him notorious down here because he was so generous. He was known for holding court at the Cumberland Hotel. He was also found to be part of a rum ring operation based in the Greenwich area, which is how I kind of got on to this information just overall. This is how I was able to uncover some of this information. He had two lieutenants, Cypril Eppinger and Doc Dolan, alongside some other Greenwich farmers who were charged with breaking prohibition laws by transporting the liquor on behalf of Callahan and his lieutenants. This investigation looked into several charges, which included rum running, threats, and intimidation against citizens and others involved, such as workers, to keep them quiet. This was not the first time that Callahan was caught in Cumberland County distributing illegal liquor during the Prohibition era. He was charged with conspiracy in the Cumberland County courts in October of 1925, for which he only paid a $500 fine, which is steep even now, but he got away pretty easily. He was then accused of being in a sedan that was following a liquor truck during his second conviction, assumably ensuring that this truck got to where it was supposed to be going. Um, no one could positively identify Callahan as to being in the car involved in the bootlegging with a truck carrying the illegal rum. So there was no one to indicate him specifically as being part of this ring. He was also accused of trying to invite another gentleman who served as a witness to join his operation. He allegedly introduced himself under a false name, and when that fact was pointed out to him, because he was, like I said, a very notorious person, he responded with something along the lines of, "I wanted to see how you would react to the fake name," trying to like weed him out, see if he was going to be a part of this. Um, This was the most convincing evidence of the entire trial, that, Callahan was indeed a rum runner and the ringleader of this prohibition era. era ring. So as of September 13th in 1930, Callahan's lieutenant, Cyprill Eppinger, was found not guilty of the charges because there was no evidence to indicate that he was involved in the events of November 5th, 1929, the second time that Callahan gets caught. After a new trial, Callahan and two other Greenwich farmers pleaded non-volt, which is also known as no contest now, to the charges. And then they were each charged a fine of $1,000, if you want to go to the next slide. In addition to numerous accounts of rum smuggling in the county, there were also several instances where those in both Bridgeton and Millville were specifically caught brewing and selling, as well as operating speakeasies. With the ability to make home brews, speakeasies started popping up around the Cumberland County area because somewhere the alcohol that was being distributed needed somewhere to go. So, in towns such as Greenwich, Bridgeton, Fortescue, and Millville, hardware stores and grocery stores were selling the necessary supplies to make homebrew because they were easy things to get your hands on. So, they either ignored the fact that making homebrew was illegal and selling it as well, or they just didn't know, or they claimed not to know. People throughout the United States, as we all know, especially on the East Coast, ignored prohibition laws in favor of fun, making a living, and otherwise choosing to not believe in something that they deemed to be unfair.
Any questions?
Yeah, question. I didn't realize that there was that early that Prohibition had started, Bruce. Was there any religious organization that was an impetus to the Prohibition, getting Prohibition started behind the scenes? Or?
Yeah, it was specifically the Protestants that were particularly against for prohibition against alcohol because that's kind of where that idea of corruption comes from, believing that family men can easily be turned by alcohol. And so with that religious like reform that's going through the country during the 1830s, that's kind of where these ideas are coming from, and then it just kind of spreads like wildfire after that. Yes.
Was this tradition of moonshine at all in this area?
I didn't find anything specifically about moonshine. It just said homebrew.
Seems like it'd be easy to do,
Yeah.
And were they rum runners? Was it mostly rum from like the Caribbean, or was there other alcohol?
It's mostly rum specifically because things like beer and wine don't transport very well, especially on like the seas, because you can't really control the temperature. They need like specific conditions in order to remain good. But harder liquors like whiskey and rum specifically were kind of much easier to transport over the Atlantic.
So you're referring to mainly beer.
Yes. Yep. Tom.
In Florence Township, which is 10 miles that way, we had some farms that had upland right on the creeks. And the word was back in this era that boats would come up to those banks, unload. There was a specific farm that I used to farm. But he dug a pit underneath his bullpen, hid the rum in that pit. And when the revenuers came around looking, they weren't going in that bullpen.
Yeah.
Now that same guy was caught driving a load of rum up the Cedarville Millville Road. Revenuers got behind him. He ran the truck into the woods and then left the truck, but they got him in there.
Yeah.
And one of the ways they hid it was some farmers said, I got paid X amount of money to leave so many boxes of lettuce along the side of the road. And when the truck would come back up from Bay Point with their load, they put the lettuce all around it so the revenuers could see it.
Yeah. Yeah, Rosemary.
You say that the people chose to ignore the rules because they were unfair. What part of benefiting the local economy did their books I didn't know play into it?
It was kind of a poorly kept secret. Everyone was kind of in on it, and because everybody in Bridgeton, because it's a small community, especially during that time, everyone knows each other. So because it does kind of benefit that local economy, the officers and people, prohibition agents who were corrupt, are willing to look the other way to benefit the local economy, even though they were illegal operations. Yes.
Kind of like now with marijuana. I mean, now it's legal, but just when alcohol became legal, it took 15 years before liquor stores actually got business again. They still went to their common sources.
Yeah.
How much money were these guys making running the rum? I mean, they got $500,000 fine. That's a sizable amount.
Yeah, it was a $5,000 fine. I'm sorry, I
Okay.
misspoke. But yeah, so it was such a lucrative business because if you want something bad enough and you have the money to pay for it, you will find a way to make it work. So that's how mobsters were able to rise so quickly and get so rich so quickly, because it was like they were making unbelievable amounts of money. I don't have exact dollar amounts, but a lot of money. Yeah.
It's always been a rumor that the Kennedy family was very invested in the bootleg alcohol industry, and that is actually how they made their fortune.
Mhm.
Did you find any evidence to support that?
Oh yeah, Joseph P. Kennedy was notorious for being part of the bootlegging operations. He operated out of Boston specifically because was obviously where his family is kind of based out of, but he was known to also participate in Atlantic City area operations. But yeah, that's completely true. That's how his family became so famous, because he was not only like involved in the legal system as forget exactly what his role was in the United States, but yeah, so they had a huge role in the Prohibition era. Yeah.
Is there any provision made in the law, 1919, to compensate or otherwise ease the pain on people that owned saloons? What happened to them? There's their livelihood. They own a saloon, they're selling stuff. They got 1 year to find something else to do.
Yeah.
Was there anything in the law that they compensated them?
Yeah, they didn't get nearly as much compensation as they maybe should have for losing their entire livelihood, but there was some evidence that there was some kind of adjustment period of like, here, we'll help you out a little bit because we're no longer condoning your business
Is
practices.
that the federal or the state government that
It was the federal government. Yeah.
Did the government, either the Coast Guard or Navy, ever go after these ships, offshore ships? And two, did they ever go back to the Caribbean countries, to kind of retaliate in some way?
The Coast Guard and the Coast Guard specifically did get involved in like chasing these ships down. Sometimes they were successful, but sometimes they were outrun, especially with smaller boats. But a lot of the rum runners would just kind of they themselves would retreat back to international waters like the Bahamas, Canada, Newfoundland, places like that. But the Coast Guard didn't have jurisdiction there,
They couldn't go after
so they couldn't go after them.
Did the
Yeah.
government ever go after, the country in the Bahamas?
No, because it wasn't worth getting involved in any kind of legal battles in that regard, at least. Yeah.
From your research, how accurate would you say this depictions like Boardwalk Empire, for example, because like even though Nucky, his name's changed from Steve Buscemi's character from what from the historical figure he's meant to represent. And I'm sure they've intensified more of that particular character's like mobsterness in the show than what actually was occurring. But how good of a representative do you think that show is to reflect that time period?
For what it is, I think it does a better job than a lot of other depictions of not only that time period, but history in general. But at the end of the day, it was a TV show. It was meant to entertain, not educate. So they took a lot of liberties with how things were being done and like the amount of, like, it was a lot more of a personal story about the character as opposed to a more real story about the person himself. So I would say it was moderately accurate. I know I pointed out several inaccuracies over the course of my watching the show, but overall, it was not the worst depiction of a historical time period that I've ever seen. It was okay. Yeah.
2 points. One, the drugstores, even during Prohibition, sold wine kits,
Hmm.
more or less. And the second point is, the monies that they made, someone like Al Capone ran soup kitchens that fed most of the city during all of Prohibition. As much of an evil bastard that he was, he did do a number of things that were good for the society at the time.
Yeah, because he had the money. Like look at Chick Callahan. He was also a very generous person, helped out a lot of people in Fortescue during that period. And he was well liked. He was incredibly well liked. So even though, and that's why they kind of act as though, despite operating outside of the law, they don't consider themselves to be criminals because they're not, in their minds, doing anything wrong by ignoring a law that they don't think is fair in the first place.
Is that Chuck Callahan or Chick? What do you-
Chick Callahan. He's originally from North Jersey. Yes.
Did the government ever send Elliot Ness into Cumberland County? To root out the evil rum runners?
No, there was no indication. It was mostly just can't remember his name off the top of my head. Fred Stinger, I think his name was the Fred something was the judge who was like, or Stanger, I'm sorry. It was Judge Stanger who was weeding out these people specifically, seeking them out, hunting them out. Yes.
During this period, and this goes beyond Cumberland County.
Mhm.
But is it Prohibition was like 10 years?
Yeah, roughly. It ended about 1930, 1931.
Was there any evidence or studies to show that because alcohol consumption ostensibly was lower during this period, that other people resorted to other drugs like marijuana, that type of thing, or?
I didn't find any indication of that specifically. I can imagine
I
that.
don't think it was any lower. It was a completely failed policy.
Yes,
Yeah.
no, yeah.
Yeah, if I had to guess, I would imagine things like cocaine was probably a little bit more of a popular drug in a replacement of alcohol, but because most people were just kind of ignoring the law anyway, there wasn't any specific, solid, conclusive evidence that it did or did not help anybody to prohibit this alcohol consumption because they were doing it anyway. Yeah.
How, I imagine it impacted negatively, but did you were they instantaneous that once Prohibition was done, that rum running and bootlegging was completely done? And also what other avenues of smuggling or whatever did these smaller scale criminals resort to as an alternative to?
So as Prohibition is kind of winding down in 1928, 1929, specifically the New York mobsters and a little bit in Chicago, not Al Capone specifically, but some of the others are kind of getting involved in now heroin dealing and the drug trade because it was becoming really popular in the Bahamas and Florida in those kind of areas. So then they were just kind of trafficking them up through the United States because they're already transporting illegal alcohol. Now they're getting involved in other forms of illegal activity. So then they kind of start pushing that throughout this area and then up and through Canada as well. Yes.
Did rum running as a business, right? Compared to other legal enterprises like the oyster industry, caviar industry, which was very thriving during the same period of time.
Mhm.
How did it compare? I mean, obviously, I don't think you had these people participating in these activities, but how would you say it compared in terms of income, prosperity?
I would say because there wasn't any large scale mob operations being operated specifically out of Cumberland County, they're probably about neck and neck. You could probably make about the same amount of money, like maybe shucking oysters or transporting them from land to sea physically, just like carrying stuff off the ships, doing the same thing rum running. But because it was a more lucrative business, because it was a lot more widespread, it was probably even maybe a little bit more.
You think some people hid their rum in their oyster catchers?
You know what? I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case. I feel like that'd be a really good place to look. No one wants to go look in the thing that smells like oysters. Yes.
You said that the prohibition lasted about 10 years. What was it that turned the tide? Made it stop?
The government just kind of gave up because it was just so clearly not working. It was so easy to kind of corrupt prohibition agents that they just gave up enforcing it. It stopped funding money towards it because it was a waste because they weren't using anything. Yes.
Anything about like those speakeasies, like around, I think like Horseshoe and
Mhm.
Seabreeze was rumored that, I mean, did a lot come around, come in and stay here, or did more of it just go out? Do they know how much really happened with speakeasies?
A lot of them got shut down pretty quickly. There was one example of a speakeasy being run out of Bridgeton where a woman whose husband was frequenting the speakeasy, she just kind of got fed up with him frequenting the speakeasy, so she called the cops on him and was like, "Hey, there's this speakeasy being operated on I think it was Pearl Street even in Bridgeton," and yeah, called the cops on her own husband because she was tired of him going to the speakeasy every night. So a lot of them often got shut down like relatively quickly because the cops were like, listen, we're looking the other way with this homebrew thing, but the speakeasies you're trying to do a little bit too much. Yes.
Speaking of spurned women, were there female rum runners?
I didn't come across any indication of females being involved in the rum running ring. Just the woman calling the cops on her husband. Any other questions? Yes.
Was there a public proclamation that prohibition was over? I mean, was it in the newspapers? It's no longer going to be the law.
Yeah, much like the same way, if anyone has watched Boardwalk Empire in here, how they celebrate the countdown at the very first episode, countdown to Prohibition, and they have a big party. Basically, the same thing happens at the end of Prohibition. They just it gets announced that Prohibition is being repealed. Yeah, and they just have a party about it. Yes.
I would imagine since it was a constitutional amendment, it had to have a reciprocal law saying it's no longer in force.
Yeah. Yeah, they kind of make an announcement and kind of put into law this is no longer a constitutional thing. We're repealing it. We're taking it away, and it just kind of gets taken out of history. Yes.
How, so do you know, I mean, because of just how the research works. How, if the rum runners who are like moving material down here, who they were connected to, like who their higher boss was? Because these guys were just like the bottom of the tier, right? And
Yeah.
then, like there's somebody above them managing them, I imagine, and then
Yeah.
like, the higher guy who's like, and like I said, I wouldn't, because the documentation I'm sure is thin, because
It actually is very
all is word of
thin.
mouth.
Yeah, it is very thin because a lot of people were either asked to be quiet or were convinced to be quiet. A lot of like either money or threats were used to kind of keep these people from saying like, oh, this is the person I was working for during Prohibition, rum running. Chick Callahan was the only person that I found specifically named as being a like leader. And then his lieutenants, who were those kind of managers of the lower farmers that were kind of distributing the alcohol.
Where were these ships coming, there's offshore, where were they coming from with the Savannah, from the Caribbean, or are they?
Sometimes they were coming from the Caribbean, sometimes they were coming from the Bahamas, Canada, England, Ireland, places like that. Anywhere that it was legal to produce alcohol, it would kind of go through the mobsters. They would have all these kind of connections in these different places, and then they would essentially place orders, and that's how they kind of came down to rum row.
Actually, any border, Canada, Mexico during Prohibition, all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like marijuana today. Only now we grow it here.
Yeah.
I imagine, because I forget when the Great Depression, I imagine there was a connection between the end of Prohibition and the Depression.
I'm
And
actually
kind of growth of I mean, I might be incorrect, but I was just thinking growth of tax revenue now that alcohol was back to being legal.
I'm actually not totally sure, but that seems like something I'm going to research next. That sounds really interesting.
I thought of another research topic for me personally.
Oh, perfect.
Share that with you.
Yes, please. I'm so excited to hear about it.
Any other?
So the next speaker series will be on how the end of Prohibition.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Basically, yeah.
And Tori's research is also a little unique as it has a t-shirt associated with it on our website. Was it straight out of Rum Row? It's a t-shirt on our website, so if you want to go on there, purchase that with Percy's Go to Society. But thank you, Tori, so much for being here. There's refreshments and everyone have your thoughts. Thank you for all coming.
Yeah, for sure.
Started.